Altered carbon takes place in a universe where all humans are implanted with a cortical stack at the base of the spine. Cortical stack is a kind of digital black box flight recorder for the human consciousness, and in the event that your body is damaged beyond repair or even destroyed, your digital self, your consciousness, the recording of your consciousness, can be extracted from the cortical stack here and then inserted into another body, a clone or somebody else's body, or even stored on a mainframe. So in essence, conferring upon human beings practical immortality. I think the most interesting thing that happened during the writing of Altered Carbon, in terms of the insights that I gained, was the realization that there are limits to the way we've been engineered by our evolution, by our history as a species. In the book, certain people, those who are not especially wealthy certainly, choose after 2 or 3 lifetimes simply to stop coming back. They've had enough, they've lived through 2 or 3 lifetimes, going through old age each time because they don't have the resources to skip the old age and jump straight into a new body as soon as they start to get a little bit twitchy. And so those people eventually become tired of the way things work. They have themselves stored somewhere as a digital self and brought out in a rental body just for special occasions, like the birthday of a great-granddaughter, perhaps the graduation of some member of the family further down the line, many generations on. But they basically are content to die, or to be temporarily dead anyway. And I think this was part of a greater realization that understood that no matter what technology you apply to humans, we are still constrained by the evolution that we share and where we've come from as a species. And that, in fact, is a larger insight, I think, into any technological change and a lot of the other technology in the books and in most of my science fiction. The idea that in the end, you are dealing with human beings, and unless you radically modify those human beings, then any technology that they access will always be subject to the whims and bizarre quirks that are inherent in our evolved systems, in our biology, in who we are as an evolved species. And that is something that I don't think humans have any way to escape, at least not through this technology. Though if you want to talk about genetic modification, that then becomes another kettle of fish, which I'd be happy to talk with you about some other time. Cheers. Bye.
So welcome to the Future of Aging panel. As you probably know, aging is not a new phenomenon at all. What is new is how much we talk about it and also what we are looking about it. So we look at its effects on the social and tax systems, its effects on the poverty of the population, and sometimes and potentially also on its effects on democratic elections. To talk about this very complex issue, I have here with me 3 outstanding panelists, so let me introduce them to you. First of all, I have Professor Rainer Münz. Rainer is a special advisor on migration and demography of the European Political Strategy Center of the European Commission, and he worked in many renowned think tanks in university and international institutions, but just to mention one, is currently working as one of the chairs of the World Bank Global Knowledge Partnership on Migration and Development. Then next to him we have Professor Lorna Harries, who has such a complicated bio that I really have to read it. So Lorna holds personal chair in molecular genetics at the University of Exeter Medical School. Among the different achievements, her team has discovered a new hallmark of aging, which they are now exploring as future therapeutic targets for age-related disease. And I hope she will explain to us later on what all this means. And finally, we have with us Dr. Burrows. Mathew is the director of the Atlantic Council's Foresight, Strategic and Risks Initiatives. In 2014, he published a book on the future declassified, megatrends that will undo the world unless we take action. And he definitely should know which trends these are, because he worked for 28 years for CIA and the State Department. You can read all about their many achievements, but now we're going to dive directly into the topic of the conversation. Rainer, I will start with you. So we just mentioned the fact that aging is not a new phenomenon. We have been aging for 200 years now. And collectively, it has been calculated that we are aging 3 months older every year. So why do you think are we worrying about aging now? Why it's so important today?
When we're talking about aging, that's about quite different things we're talking. And so aging is something that is related to calendar, so to time that passes by. And so that's a trivial thing that happens to each and every one of us. We're getting older by the day. Sorry for the bad news, but there's some good news in the presentation as well. So then we are aging through an institutional life cycle. The fact that we are aging individually comes to us. We have to go to school. We are eligible for a driver's license in countries where they still draft men, or if you take Israel or Eritrea, also women have to go to military service or an alternate military service. We are eligible for studies. We are entering working age. And then there is a mandatory retirement age in most developed societies, but many people are hoping to reach this retirement as early as possible without aging themselves. This would be the ideal world. Anyhow. Then we have biological aging, which is a DNA-related process which has to do with the ability of our DNA to reduplicate itself, and so the renewal of cells that we are having. And then there's demographic aging, which we're talking about. So that's the good news. You have already mentioned it. We have seen since the 1850s all the way up an increase in average life expectancy globally, in Europe, in Belgium, in Germany, in Austria, in Italy, wherever you go to. Most countries, there's a few exceptions. And we have been gaining between 2 and 3 months a year, which means it was already worth coming to the ESPAS conference, because that's 5 hours a day that you are gaining in life expectancy. So during the 2 days of the ESPAS conference, your and my life expectancy has already increased by 10 hours, yeah? 10 hours, yeah? And the next 2 days where we have no ESPAS conference, another 10 hours, something like that. Now, if you come unprepared to a lecture like myself today, it would be worth having the 5 hours immediately, because then you would always be prepared on time, in a good mood. But unfortunately, so that's the sad news and the good news, you're only getting these 10 hours at the end of your life, yeah? It pushes your death further away. And so finally, we come to demographic aging. Demographic aging happens, and this is totally unrelated to biological phenomena. You and I, we would be getting older also in a demographically non-aging society. Our biological aging is totally unrelated to demographic aging. That's important to understand. And when you look, so we are here in a Foresight exercise, but demography is even closer to Foresight. This is a forecast we can make, because many people who are alive today will be alive in 10, 20, 30, 40 years from now, so we can make demographic projections. And the demographic projection, if you see the inner part, light blue, this is the age pyramid of the global population in the 1950s. The dark blue shaded part is the population pyramid that we're having today. And the outer red dotted line, this is the expected population pyramid we will have at the end of the 21st century. And when you look at the base of the pyramid, you see the projected number of young children today, and the projected number of young children in 80 years from now is almost the same. So the whole increase from 7 to 10 billion people will take place at higher age groups, and in particular among the elderly. So these are the two groups that will grow in the future. So the added population will be mostly elderly people. And the reason why we are fearing, we are hoping for aging and we are fearing. We are hoping for aging that we will not die anytime soon, and we will stay in a healthy state. But at the same time, it would be most convenient if most people around ourselves would die and we would stay alive, because there, I mean, all the social provisions would be for us. Financing the pension system would be easy. I could ask for even much more pension than I would be entitled to, because everyone else would be dead around myself, except my beloved ones, right? So I would say there is hope and there is fear. The hope is I'm gonna die late. Hopefully never, but as late as possible. I should stay healthy. So the ideal world is you die healthy, yeah? Till the last day of your life, you're very healthy, you don't need any care, and then you die, suddenly die from one day to another. And the other hope is that this would not apply to everyone. Now, unfortunately, it applies to almost everyone. This is why global life expectancy is increasing. So it's a mixed blessing, right?
Thank you so much. I think you created the best branding for this conference. The ESPAS conference make you live longer. And so after this, the organizers should thank you, Rainer, probably. I have another question for you. You mentioned healthy aging, but I think we will talk about it with Lorna. But you're also an expert about migration. So we hear a lot about the fact that Europe is getting older, while we have a demographic boom in Middle East, in Africa. Do you think the impact that this have on our, migration, the impact it could have on Europe age group, has this an effect of the way we perceive also aging? Is this something you also think about in your research?
Yeah, there's two things. Migration happens with or without aging. Now, there's one of the most unfortunate things that no one ever thinks of, why migrants should be unpopular. Unfortunately, migrants are also aging. Yeah? So the ideal migrant would be a person always the same age category. So we are aging, the migrants do not. But unfortunately, it's not the case. So the more people you bring today, the more elderly you will have tomorrow. At least in the European or the US or the Canadian or Australian model. Now, there's countries that have found an exception to this. The Gulf states, for example. You bring in young people, you kick them out as soon as you no longer need them, and you will never have to care about their old age. Yeah? That's the Gulf state model. Now, these are our allies, but I wouldn't say that we should emulate this. Yeah. So if you think you bring in people, you integrate them, you give them rights, it will contribute to future aging. Now, what you can do with migration is to fill the gap on the labor market. It's almost impossible to think that by bringing more people in, you could avoid the aging of the future. That's I think a wrong equation that is quite often made. Now, if you want to fill the gap on the labor market of tomorrow, it's not just about bringing people. You would need to bring people who bring qualifications that are needed. Or you would need mechanisms that easily and rapidly qualify those people for your labor market needs. Yeah? So it's not to fill up Europe with people, because you say there's too many Africans and not enough Europeans, so it's like bringing water from A to B. That's a demographically naive assumption that you can have. A rural society could work like that, where you just need manual labor in order to produce calories. So if a land falls idle and you want to produce food, then almost anybody could work there. But a highly developed society like ours is not just in need of people, if it wants to continue at the level we're having, is in need of qualified people, of people who are doing the jobs that cannot be filled and recruited from within. And that's a trick. So either you bring qualified people by a mechanism of selection, or you have a well-functioning educational system for adults that would be able to re-qualify people as soon as possible to bring them into the labor market. That's the main answer to it.
Thank you so much. I'm sure the audience will have a lot of questions on it later on. So let's move to Lorna. First, a very quick question. Is what we saw in the video possible?
Short answer, not presently.
Now a longer question. So we talk a lot about everybody's being worried about aging, but is this really an illness, or should we just want to live 300 years old, as we just saw in the video? Thank you.
Okay, is this on? Can you hear me? Yeah. All right, so I think the short answer is yes and no. So I think the natural normal aging, the sort of aging that we just heard about, the passage of time, that's not an illness, that's natural, that's what happens. But unhealthy aging, the collection of disabilities and frailty and all of those things that actually are characteristic of aging and what we all think about when we think about aging, I think, yes, those are an illness. And I think defining it as an illness means it is potentially treatable or even curable. So if you think these days, 1 in 8 of us will come down with dementia, 10 million people are living with arthritis. And in the UK, somewhere between 40 and 50% of our healthcare budget is spent on treating the diseases of ageing. Now, ageing, however, is heterogeneous. We all know people who've lived into their 90s and even their hundreds, relatively healthy, able to live autonomously and have a good quality of life. But we also know people who succumb to age-related diseases, the cardiovascular diseases, the dementias, all of the nasty things that we associate with ageing in their 60s and 70s and have decades of ill health. So that tells me that there's a good way of ageing and a bad way of ageing. And the bad way of ageing, I think, is something broken. Now, all of those diseases of ageing, we now know actually, rather than having a unique cause for each of them, they actually have common roots. And ageing and the diseases of ageing tend to arise from the failure of a few basic health maintenance mechanisms that together collectively are called the hallmarks of ageing. There are about 9 or 10 of them. And actually any one of those are good candidates for drivers of ageing. And importantly, they are potential therapeutic targets that we can use to actually target the causes of ageing. So the one I want to focus on is a phenomenon called cellular senescence. So this is basically the accumulation of old cells in all of the tissues of your body. And these old cells, they don't act how they should. They don't have the functions that those cells are supposed to have. They don't do what they're supposed to. They don't grow. They stop growing. But importantly, they also start to throw out a cocktail of signals that tell all the cells around them that, hey, I'm old, and you have been around about the same time as I have, so you must be old too, and also drive them into senescence. And we now know that the accumulation of these senescent cells is a major driver of ageing. And we know this because there are some really elegant experiments that have been done in the past sort of 10 years or so, maybe a little bit more frequent than that, firstly in mice, where they're able to knock out, to get rid of all of those aged cells in that mouse. And that mouse shows a remarkable rejuvenation. That mouse is able to run longer and faster. He has better cardiac function. He has better renal function. He has better immune function. So all of those things that we associate with aging, we're able to effectively reverse by removing senescent cells. And that's great if you're a mouse, okay? It's a little bit more complicated in people because we're not allowed to mess around with the genetics of people in the same ways that we are with mice. But in the last year, there have been 3 studies where people have used usually chemical or small molecule ways of actually achieving the same aim. So the first was a condition called idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, which is an accelerated disease of aging of the lung. So these people get a lot of fibrosis in their lung, and it's a really nasty disease. So using a cocktail of chemicals, in the last 6 months or so, there was a paper that came out that suggested actually if you can remove the senescent cells from the lung, you can actually make these people, it's a small study and there needs to be a lot more work done on it, but they can actually walk longer. They can do things like stand up from a chair, which actually a lot of compromised older folks with things like IPF can't do. And again, it's small. Very recently, there was another study on chronic kidney disease. This is another disease characterized by the accumulation of these old senescent cells. And these folks were actually able to show a decrease in senescent cells in these patients, accompanied by an increase in renal function. So this is all very promising. And very recently, a team from the Mayo Clinic managed to show that with a different cocktail of chemicals, they were able to actually turn back the epigenetic clock. So this is the clock that your DNA has. It accrues chemical signatures as you get older. And you can actually turn that back by about 2.5 years or thereabouts by these means. So I would say that treating aging actually isn't science fiction. We've got a lot of work to do. We need an injection of resource and infrastructure to bring this about. But I think it's possible that we could start to see some advances by 2030. In terms of living till sort of our 300s, I don't think we're going to get there. I think human beings actually have a natural sell-by date. We are evolved to live to about 40, so we're already actually doing pretty well. There are parts of the world where they're called blue zones, where people live an awful long time. Their average age is about 100. Even in the blue zones, people don't live much past 115 or so, but even so, that's a good gain. But I think what we need to be concentrating on is not lifespan extension, it is health span expansion. It is the number of healthy years.
Thank you so much, Lorna. And in fact, in the ESPAS report, it has been identified improving ages as one of the game changers. So this brings me to my next question to you. You've been mentioning, rightly so, a lot healthy aging, but do you see public spending going in the right direction? I mean, I know probably, tell us what you can, but this is a friendly circle. But are there enough of public research, finance that are going in this direction of healthy aging? Thank you.
That's a really easy question to answer. The answer there is absolutely not. So people tend to be throwing a lot of money at treating the diseases of aging. So if you're a cancer researcher, you're kind of laughing. You know, it's easy to get money for cancer, for arthritis. But actually my point is that what we need to be doing is to be treating those common causes and actually funding for basic aging research, for uncovering those basic molecular mechanisms is practically nil. In the UK, there is only one place that actually does that exclusively, and I'm a trustee for them, and we have a very, very small pot of money to do. So that is an area where we really need to bring in a lot more resource to deal with that. I think part of the problem is these ideas are a little bit out there, they're a little bit unusual. People have never come across the concept that you might be able to influence aging. So I think part of it is these new studies that are coming out now showing that it's actually possible to do this. I think that will help. But we need a big injection of investment to be able to move this forward.
Thank you so much. Mathew, your turn. Theoretically, or at least this is what we think, elderly people should be more peaceful. So isn't it good news, the fact that we are aging, or do you see some effects on this volatile and violent world?
I mean, you know, there's lots of studies that show that as societies age, they tend to get less involved in wars. But I think, you know, you have this issue globally that in the advanced economies, everybody is aging. I mean, the societies are aging. But you have another part of the world, and even if you look out to 2030, you have large parts of sub-Saharan Africa, parts of Central Asia, that are still going to be extremely young. So calculation, Afghanistan, you know, 48%, this is in 2030, of the population is still youthful, you know, below 20 years old. So that puts huge amount of strains on their society, and there is a correlation there that there's an increased risk of internal conflict and also external conflict. So it doesn't necessarily mean, even though this part of the world is aging, that the world will become less conflicted. The second part of this is that in terms of our global future, if you're thinking, you know, increasingly the global economy is going to rely a lot on the workforce in sub-Saharan Africa and the whole rest of the world. So you have calculation by 2050 that 1 out of 4 people in the workforce are going to be African. So it is also in our interest, and I think this gets to the migration question, and I'm not actually, don't quite share your view. I think you tilt a little bit against migration as a solution to some of our societal aging issue. I would say that we have actually, because we're all living on the same planet, and we do want a healthy global economy, even, you know, if you're living in the richest part of the world, it's still benefit that you have a global economy, and that also means potentially less conflict. That we also think about how do we get, you know, help the developing countries, the low income countries, to actually educate their young. Because that is you know, we have problems, and we will have increasing problems paying for our social welfare, just because of the issue that, you know, our societies, the median age is increasing, you have fewer people in the workforce, there's less, potentially there's less productivity and growth there, although that could possibly be solved. But on the other side, if you're in the developing world, you have, you know, a huge part of your population in the younger years, and they don't usually have the means to bring their skill levels up. That's something that the developed world could help with. And some of that is usually through migration. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean permanent migration, but in terms of educate, give skills, bring, level out the playing field, you could say, between the advanced and the developing world. I think that will become a huge problem, looking forward, because too, there's, we really don't know if world population is going to plateau, which we hope, in the 2050s, 2060s. A lot of it depends on West Africa and what, the changes in the structure there, the aging structure. That it's for all of our sakes, we hope that the global population begins to plateau.
Thank you. Rainer, do you want to react or, yeah?
Happy to react. So why are we hoping, or why is hope that the global population will plateau? This has to do with the fact that today, 40% of mankind are living in countries where the number of children per family is below 2. And as soon as it would reach 50 or 60%, there is hope at the horizon that population will plateau. There's still a demographic momentum because we have plenty of young people who will have children later on, so it doesn't kick in automatically. Now, when it comes to migration and the cost of social welfare, there's an equal equation. I've shown, and you have mentioned it at the beginning, if we assume that your and my life expectancy are increasing by 3 months a year, and we have 5 million people who are retiring every year in Europe, if you would push retirement age by just these 3 months that we are gaining into the future, it would mean that we could retain 1.75 million workers in the workforce if we only manage to push retirement age by 3 months a year. If we would manage to increase retirement age by 1 year, we could retain 5 million people in the workforce. So it's not a given that pension costs need to go up and we create a gap in the labor force by aging if we would only accept to work longer than we do today. And so the question is, if we have that gap because of small numbers of children that were born in the past, do we want to fill that gap with immigrants? Then we would, in my view, need the right type of immigrant or to qualify them. Or do we want to work longer? Or do we want to replace existing jobs by robots, for example? So we want to go the automated way. And there is an aging, the most rapidly aging society in the world with the highest life expectancy in the world is Japan. And the Japanese have decided not to bring in immigrants, but to automatize certain elements of their economy, including caregiving. Yeah, so robots giving care to you. They smile, they speak your language, maybe they even know you by first name. You can program this so they get a human touch. Things like that. That's possible. And I think if we want to anticipate the future, it's important to see that there's different avenues, and probably it's not the one or the other, it could be a mix of them, but at least, and this is the beauty of Foresight, yeah, to bring it to life, to understand what these alternative futures might be and are. Because today we think we have an entitlement to retire at 57, at 100% of our last salary, if possible, but we want to live ever longer without thinking about the burden that this would mean for the next generation. And I think we need to get out of that comfort zone. Now, it's easy for me to say that. Apparently, you see, I'm not running for parliament. I'm not running to become the prime minister of my country anytime soon. But at least we need to develop the ground for that kind of political decisions that need to be made in the future. Yeah?
Thank you. Matt, before giving you the floor again, I would also like to ask you, so in your book, Future Declassified, did you research about aging and how did you address this? And also about the democratic elections, because when we look at the age population, of the voting age population now, many times we think that the fact that we have elderly people voting have brought to Brexit or to the election of Trump. Do you see an impact in the future? Do you see a correlation about it? Thank you.
Yeah, it was striking that in the last panel on inequality, there wasn't any actual mention of intergenerational inequality. And that probably, you know, particularly for younger members of the audience, I mean, that is an everyday issue and problem. So you find in opinion polls in the US, you know, most of the 35 and younger don't think Social Security is going to be around because it will be all spent on those in this. And one thing that we haven't mentioned is one of the things exacerbating societal aging in the developed world is you know, these are the boomers going into retirement. And so you've had this huge, you know, generation that actually has fueled a lot of the economic growth, and now suddenly are going into their retirement. So it rather perverts the age structure throughout the rest of society. I think if you look at all the indications, I mean, in the US we've had, you know, with the younger millennials, they're marrying later, they have very little wealth accumulation, and in the opinion polls, you see increasingly Americans are becoming, you know, particularly younger people are becoming very pessimistic about their chances of actually doing better than their fathers or mothers. And this is, I think we had the discussion yesterday about populism, but this is one of the sources that you just don't feel that there's much hope for you. And, you know, particularly in a society like the US, where you grow up with this idea that you're supposed to do better than your parents and grandparents. And that is now stopping. And a lot of it is you know, housing is a lot more expensive. So you can't possibly afford something unless you have wealthy parents. You know, they're waiting longer and longer to try to buy something, particularly in the urban areas, which are incredibly expensive. San Francisco, it's, you know, you're talking about a median house price close to $1 million. So, and then education, because now it's different in Europe, but education in the US is often paid. I mean, if you want to get your children's best education, you often trying to think about private education. The private schools in New York and Washington, for example, they cost, for beginning at kindergarten, more than sending your child to Harvard. And there's a huge, as intense, actually competition to get your children into the best private schools. So, you know, this feeling of that basically you're lost as a generation, I think is an issue that's, you know, particularly pronounced, I would say, in the US, but maybe also I know in Britain it is as well. You have huge studies on it. And the final part of this, as you mentioned, is that seniors are the ones who tend to vote more. You know, in the US, you have very low voter participation in the 60%. That's a good turnout, actually, if you can get 60%. It's mostly older, and they are the ones that voted in Britain for Brexit. They're the ones, you know, that vote for Trump. And also, it's skewed in terms of the Republican Party now is aging quite quickly. It tends to be filled with a lot of older people, whereas the Democrats are somewhat younger. So that's, you know, I think these are huge problems. There's no quick solution for any of these. One thing would be, a quick solution is to get younger people out to vote and get them much more politically active than they are. Obama tried to do that and succeeded, but one of the problems with the Clinton campaign is that it lost some of its younger voter support and also among the minorities.
Thank you so much. We've been asked to respect the timing, but before opening to the audience, so you can already start thinking about all the questions you want to ask the panelists, I would still like to ask to the three of you a question. You already mentioned that we should try to attract more young people to vote, so I guess this would be the public sector, one of the public sector, not obligation, but a policy they should try to have, and also more research, funding more research. But do you see any other burning policy gaps? Do you see other areas that the public sector should address in order to have a healthy aging and to achieve that? Who wants to start? Lorna?
Okay, so the elephant in the room here is we can all talk about, you know, the new molecular ways that we can stop aging. Actually, the biggest way that you can age well is to eat less and move more. Exercise is the number one most successful intervention for aging. We all know what we're supposed to be doing. Actually, very few of us are doing it. So I think there needs to be some public policy, some thought into actually behaviour change and actually getting people to do the things they're supposed to. And a lot of these problems, in terms of the, you know, the physical, the physiological effects of aging, you might find are not such a problem if people were able to follow those guidelines.
The generational discrepancies that you have described rightly are not anything that is written in stone. It's not a natural law. This has to do with institutional setups. So if you think you can't afford having children because private schools are too expensive, then invest in a public school system that delivers. France is showing that this is possible. Germany is showing that this is possible. Not everywhere, but at least that's possible to have a public school system where at least 80% of the people getting out of the system are able to read and write and calculate and things like that. It's not perfect, but when you compare the PISA results with the US, you see that at least that's possible. And doesn't say that there's no possibility to improve. You can have first-class publicly funded universities. Switzerland is showing that. St. Gallen or the ETH in Zurich are places where you have a first-rate university where the tuition fee doesn't cost you a fortune. Still, they have tuition fees, but it doesn't cost you a fortune. So, I mean, there is institutional settings that are possible. Same as I said with retirement. If you think of retirement as an entitlement at age 57, then you have a barrier. But if you would link retirement age and retirement benefits to increasing life expectancy, like Sweden is doing this and other Scandinavian countries, you can have a stable retirement system that is affordable in a demographically aging society without hurting any generation. Yeah, it's a kind of a redistributive justice among generations. Every generation, if you link it to retirement to life expectancy, has statistically the same amount of years they can expect to be retired, just to give you a clue. So I think it invites us. Demographic aging is a challenge, and it's, as I said, it's unrelated to biological aging, but biological aging contributes to this because then you have more people in that age bracket where this biological last period of life kicks in, where we are spending 50 to 60% of all our healthcare expenditure. So it's a challenge from different sides, but I think we need to think a little bit out of the box, look for good examples in different countries. It can be managed. I mean, is there anybody in the room who would like to die soon in order to avoid demographic aging? I don't think so, yeah? So, I mean, that's the reason. We want to grow old, yeah? So then we need to think about how to organize this, yeah? And the people in their 40s and 50s, they have still another 20, 30, 40 years to go. So it's in our own interest to invest in that kind of future, instead of just saying we need higher retirement benefits, yeah? And the others who are still working should pay for it. So my invitation is to get out of that kind of thinking that is unfortunately quite common. Okay?
Thank you. Mathew?
You know, I think part of it is most people don't have the understanding about what is happening in the society on aging. I mean, they're looking at their own particular position, but they don't actually understand all the other consequences, I would say, particularly in the, you know, for the younger generation. So part of it is public, much more public knowledge on these forces, and that's, you know, where the Foresight comes into it. I think also in terms of legislators and policymakers, a lot don't understand quite what are the different connections, and, you know, there's been huge advances in demographic studies, so that we have a much better understanding of the correlations, just as we were talking about conflict and economic growth and so on. So we don't have those debates. So for example, we don't have a debate in the U.S. on immigration that talks about the fact that 40% of the entrepreneurs, new entrepreneurs in the U.S. are immigrants. You know, Silicon Valley was built on immigrants, but nobody mentions that at all. You know, because you have this kind of sterile debate with Republicans on one side, Democrats on the other side, but not linking it to some, you know, these broader societal trends.
Thank you so much. And I think you're making the case to have in the next College of Commissioners not only a commissioner for youth, but probably also a commissioner for, I don't know how to call it, elderly or something like this, because you mentioned very important things like eat less, move more, raising awareness among people about what are the effects of aging, and having an appropriate institutional setups. Thank you so much.